Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name's Annie Hodgson. Some of you might have seen me before at some of these events, and you're thinking, she's a chemist. What on earth's she doing? Looking after a conversation about sewing. So yes, I am from the chemistry department at the University of York, but I was brought up in a household full of sewing paraphernalia. My mother was a very gifted dressmaker. She'd been to tailoring classes, and she also did lots of fine needlework as well. And so I was brought up from a very, very tiny age, learning to sew, and I still sew to this day. Not as much as I would like to, but so that is my qualification for being here. So please forgive the interloping chemist. Right, so I am delighted to be able to introduce to you our speaker this afternoon, with whom I'll be having a relaxed conversation. So this is Barbara Burman, and she's a writer, a former academic at the University of Southampton and the University of Arts, London. She's a co-author of The Pocket, available in paperback on the store later on, a hidden history of women's lives from 1660 to 1900, so being able to see this, and also the editor of The Culture of Sewing. She's a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and lives near Cambridge. Now, today we're going to be chatting about The Point of the Needle, also available on the book table later on, which I'm sure Barbara will be very happy to sign for you should you choose to buy one. And I certainly recommend it. Very good. And so this is called The Point of the Needle, Why Sewing Matters. And that's what we're going to be chatting about this afternoon. And she's going to sort of redress the balance of the place of sewing in our lives, and says she's celebrating not only sewing's recent resurgence, but the creativity, well-being and community of those who sew. So, welcome, Barbara, and I'm going to start off. So, I don't know whether you've been to an in-conversation type of session before, but to start with, the two of us are going to have a bit of a chat. But while we're doing that, you can be thinking of your own questions, because I will then come to the audience and ask for your questions. So be thinking as we go. So Barbara, perhaps you could start off by sort of setting the book up, telling us something about what it's about, because I'm sure that not everybody's read it yet, because they're going to buy it on the bookstall afterwards. And tell us why you wrote it, sort of, you know, what was the inspiration behind the book?
Well, to be truthful, I was asked to write it. Am I audible? Mm-hmm. Yeah, good, okay. And it's wonderful to see so many people. And this is a festival of ideas, so I'm looking forward to your ideas when we move on to questions. And sewing is about ideas, so I think it fits in very well. So I was asked to write it, and first of all, I didn't want to. Then my son said, "What else are you going to do in COVID, Mum?" So... of course, writing a book when there are no libraries or archives open is it's not very nice, actually. And so it's lovely to be able to discuss with a live audience what it might all be about. I would say the book is a celebration. I want to celebrate sewing. I want to position it firmly in a grown-up conversation about why making things really matters to people, both mentally and also socially and culturally. And I also feel that it gets overlooked in conversations about craft. It's more and more acknowledged that craft, using our hands, is good for us. But what sort of work are we talking about when we talk about that? We talk about pottery, basket making, you know, hacking away with stone and all this stuff. And sewing somehow falls in between all these things. Is it a craft? Is it an art? Anyway, women do it, so it's not very important, and so on. So it's lovely to have a chance to explore these ideas. And when I sat down to think about it, like you, I had emerged, I can't say unscathed, scathed from a childhood with a mother who taught sewing and tailoring and dressmaking. I never had anything new until I was well into double figures of age. You know, shorts made from curtains and all this sort of thing.
Very Von Trapp.
Yes, but I realised in thinking back that I was raised in a tiny village in Lincolnshire. My father was very practical. He was a country vicar, but he made furniture and all sorts of other things. So we had no money, and my mother taught sewing. And everywhere I looked, people were doing things. It was a tiny agricultural village. So when your tractor broke down, you didn't phone somebody up, you fixed it. Or your gate broke, you fixed it. And so I saw this, I saw the world as a sort of practical place. And I think that sort of kind of got into me in some way. My brothers are all practical. But I couldn't keep up with my mother sewing so well, so finally. And I got the basic principles, including some upholstery that she taught me, sort of standing over me while I upholstered a chair. So I appreciate the craft of sewing. I've recently made something again. It's a skirt for my 3-year-old granddaughter. So it's 28 centimetres long, elasticated at the top. So it's hardly complex, but it was really good fun making it, and she loved it, and she put it on, and she lay down on the floor, and I said, "Oh, lying down?" And she said, "Yes, this is good laying down," she said, telling me that it wasn't a tantrum, it was a pleasurable kind of laying down.
As you do.
Yes, so that's sort of, and I've been trying to teach my 5-year-old grandson how to hold a needle and do a little bit of, we made a finger puppet, that sort of thing. So that's my kind of claim. I mean, I'm a historian, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about women's history, and particularly women, working women, non-elite women. And I got terribly fed up with the history of fashion, because that was all about style. Nobody looked inside the garments, who made them, why were they like they were, what was going on in this vast industry. It was all about surface. So I sort of hacked away at that for 30-odd years, trying to make history of clothing a more social history. And so when I was invited to do The Point of the Needle, I thought, maybe things are all coming together. Maybe in my career, and I did. And 25 years ago, I edited a book on sewing, culture of sewing, which is about consumption, gender, and home dressmaking, where I spent many happy hours, getting 60 hours of oral history tape from 20, frankly, extremely elderly ladies who I couldn't stop talking. But they all started by saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter, dear. I was just sewing. You don't want to know about that." And I said, "Well, it will be housed in the Wessex Film and Sound Archive." And one of them said, "Oh, that's like having my voice in the museum." And I said, "Yes, exactly right." And then they all got going, and they were super. And that sort of stayed with me, sensitized me, I suppose, to the issues, things they felt and thought when they were sewing. And I realized you can't find out about the history of sewing if you don't ask people, because it's absolutely absent in other kinds of formal history. I could go on, but I won't.
So, in your book, you talk both about an historical perspective as well as examining current attitudes to sewing, because I think you interviewed, or perhaps through writing of current people. And it's clear that in the past, young girls were taught to sew at home, and this seemed to be regardless of their social status, but the type of needlework they learnt seemed to be dependent on their place in society. Could you perhaps elaborate a bit on that, as to the place of learning to sew at home?
Yes. There was a sort of novelette published for children in the 1790s, I think. It's called Grandpapa's Present. And it's clearly aimed at a middling, elite sort of child. Grandpapa's Present was an ornate Moroccan leather sewing box with little cabriole feet and a little knob, and you could open it. And inside were all these wonderful little, cotton bobbins and needles and clever scissors and all sorts. And the idea was that Annie, actually her name was going to be somehow civilized by this. She was going to be made tidy, orderly, have the appropriate qualities for running a household, a servanted household in her case. And this was going to be a big part of her education. And gifts of sewing paraphernalia in families and between women friends were very, very common in the past. And so this thing arrives, and she's just overjoyed and so on. And then, of course, her mother goes off on an errand, and she invites her kitten to view the box. And so So when the mother comes back, it's complete chaos. And so the book is, of course, a moralizing book, which finally gets Annie into some kind of shape, you know. And stitching, orderly, even stitches. It's no good sewing with a short one, then a long one. It's got to be even. And that sort of drill, if you like, I think was... And it was also regarded as a kind of Christian activity, because you could sew things for the poor, you could sew things to alleviate people in your parish and so on, or you could contribute sewing materials to the local charity school, and that's what I'm thinking 18th century, early 19th century here. And on the other hand, the children in the cottages who were being, you know, helped in inverted commas by the posh people, some people complained, some commentators complained in the 18th century that poor women can't sew. And they should be able to sew. So there became this movement that we should teach sewing in schools. So by the time you get to the what you might call the nationalisation of schools in the 1870s, certainly in England, sewing, there was sewing every day. I mean, every day sewing lessons. And the poor children in those schools were being taught useful sewing, mending, but because the people who funded the schools, or, you know, the posh people, needed servants, then these young girls particularly should be taught needlework skills, which would make them good servants. And that largely consists of darning, but also marking. And in my book on the pocket, actually, it's brilliant. I got this whole space to think about marking. Most interesting how your textile goods and your resources in your house needed to be marked. You needed to know whether they were best or second best. You needed to know the date you got them. You needed to know the room they belonged in, and so on and so forth. And there's an awful lot of marking until somebody came up with a marking machine, which, you know, alleviated. But so the poorer children were being taught useful skills in terms of their future life in a domestic service, but also because it was thought it would make them a more sober, better sort of deserving poor. You know the sign of attitudes that were going about.
But they could make their own clothes as well.
They could make their own clothes, and of course people did comment on being trapped in the cycle of poverty. So you were often sewing with poorer materials, or you were trying to run your family, work in the fields, and make a few things for sale. And when you get the big kind of social investigations that go on, certainly in London, a lot in Germany actually too, on the end of the 19th century, where you're knocking door to door, saying, can I talk to the woman of the house who sews for money? You get tremendously revealing stories from these women. One woman who lived with her family of 6 in one room in Bethnal Green, this is about 1909, she says, well, as soon as he's in bed, I take his clothes and I mend them so he can have them again the next day. So the man who worked, the wage earner, his clothes, his boots, they were prioritised. And she was, you know, darning darns, as one of George Eliot's characters does, darning darns. And the middle classes, of course, it was all about keeping up appearances. A lot of that went on.
So we can see that obviously there's a huge emphasis put on teaching sewing skills in the past. Do you think that sewing skills are now sort of undervalued these days, and that perhaps young people are not being equipped to cope with just the simple things like to sew on a button if a button drops off, or, you know, darning a sock, as you've mentioned, darning darns? What do you think about that?
Well, there were 160 pictures in the pocket book. There's one picture in here, right? And what a relief. Gosh, the admin of doing all those pictures. There's one picture, half-tone plate. It's somebody sewing on a button. And that, to me, symbolises what I grew to feel as I was writing this book. And I feel angry, really, with what's happening in schools, about depriving children of practical skills, life skills, turning us all into terribly passive consumers. On average, with fast fashion clothing in Britain, we wear our garments 7 or 8 times. End. And it infuriates me, really. And I think the teaching of skills of that kind gives confidence. It gives agency. You're not a totally passive consumer. You can actually make decisions. Now, end of women have said they're really tired with being humiliated when they go into the changing rooms at M&S or wherever, and they try the garment on, they think, oh, God, it doesn't fit me. It doesn't work. So being able to, well, I keep coming back to the word agency, being able to take control a bit, it's a bit like Brexit, take back control. You can begin to feel your way into being a more knowing consumer, a more thoughtful consumer. And if you don't let children in on that, and they can't cook properly or they can't change the tyre on their bicycles, I think that's a terrible deprivation. So I do think that's wrong. I've talked to some teachers. I'm generalising, of course, as you do. But I've talked to some teachers and secondary school teachers as well, and they've said their head teachers, we don't want sewing, it's too dangerous. And the bigger the classes get,
you should try chemistry.
Yes. The bigger the classes get, the more dangerous it gets. You've got sewing machines, really dangerous, and they spread germs. That was one theory. One head teacher told this person I talked to, they spread germs. They probably do. I don't know, but and irons, whoa, very, very difficult, and scissors, let alone needles and pins. So you've got all these. You can imagine this overworked head teacher thing, and also they take up a lot of space. And they're quite expensive, sewing machines and so on. So those were some of the reasons given. So we've moved from the 19th century where you had to sew, and sometimes schools were allowed to have the children making small things, and like a collar or cuffs or a little chemise or something, to sell, and the school was allowed to keep the proceeds. So, it was really embedded. Mm-hmm. But now it doesn't seem to be. Roger Kneebone, man with a wonderful title for his job, which is teaching surgery, wrote a wonderful book called Expert, because he was worried about surgery students, when they get to the surgery sort of phase of their training in medicine, they couldn't sew, and they couldn't think in 3 dimensions. They could only really think through spending a lifetime on screens. They couldn't get the sense of 3 dimensions and how you might create such a thing. And so he sort of semi-apprenticed himself for a few months to a tailor in Savile Row. The most expert sewing you could ever find, coaxing material round and, really linings and all sorts, and let alone cutting expensive material. And he was amazed by that expertise, and he was amazed by the stages with which the human mind and the human hand goes through in order to learn these things. And he staged an event at the Art Workers Guild, actually, to discuss these very issues, because he was concerned that we were producing generations of young people who just didn't have couldn't get the physical world in some 3-dimensional way.
So it seems to be the sad demise of having to sew in schools, but yet there's...
Not entirely, of course.
Not entirely, no. But, okay, we're general. But the Great British Sewing Bee on the BBC, which is celebrating its 10th birthday at the moment, has that kind of made sewing cool again? Do you think it's encouraging people into sewing? Yes. Or is it a reflection of the fact that more people are sewing?
Well, we've got this weird sort of 2 different currents. We've got greater consumption than ever of fast fashion and superfast fashion, where there is no time lag in terms of manufacturing and selling. The seasons are gone. You don't just keep churning them out, keep buying them. You've got all that renaissance in that, or increase in that. And then you've got this renaissance in sewing for yourself. And I talked to a very interesting woman who set up a fabric and haberdashery shop in Islington in London, where the chattering classes, as it were, attend her classes and come and buy lovely, exquisite, Japanese linens and so on. It's a really nice shop. And I asked her about this question of the sewing bee, and she said she thinks it had a really big impact, and particularly on men. But she was funny about it. She said, I get men coming in and they say, I want to make a shirt. So she explains, you have just chosen the most complex thing to make. Why don't you paint a pair of pyjama shorts or something simple? But they say, oh, it can't be that difficult, meaning women do it, so it can't be difficult. So they, she serves them what they want, the shirting and the yardage and so on, and off they go. And she never sees them again, I think. But I don't know, I can't follow. But she thought the sewing bee was a wonderful thing from that point of view, because it kind of made sewing for chaps cool. And as if men hadn't been sewing for centuries.
Not the best tailors and all
yes, exactly. But that's what she thought and had observed. And she had observed a growth in this before COVID, the growth in a decreasing interest in furnishing fabrics in her shop, an increasing interest in clothing fabrics. And I've talked to, all told, counting my 25 elderly ladies 25 years ago, and there's about 80 people who contacted me during our Sewing Stories project, whose voices, I hope, really animate the book. And one woman said to me, it was a revelation, the BBC Sewing Bee, it was a revelation. I realised you could make mistakes. And it doesn't, you can rectify, well, you can't rectify every mistake,
But everybody makes mistakes,
yes. And one woman who was of the Windrush generation had come from, I think, St Kitts, actually, where all the children were taught to sew really well. And she came as a small child and was making a pair of pyjamas in the class at school in London. And she did that thing that I've done, where you end up with one leg. Do you know, you sew the wrong bits together and you've just got a sort of tube. And she went home and her auntie sorted that out for her. So she really did the learning at home in a safe environment, if you like. And I think a lot of people feel that the sewing bee is a bit like that, because you've got very engaging presenters. I did want Patrick Grant to do a bit on the back of this. Got a letter back from the agent. Patrick doesn't do endorsements.
Wait for the paperback.
Yes, I know. So there's that element, and also the participants, I think, are very encouraging, because they're all sorts of people, aren't they? They're often doctors. It's weird. There's several doctors come on, and I think it's good television, isn't it? But one person said to me, I don't think it really completely represents the sort of mental pleasures of sewing, because you're sewing against the clock. Mm. And sometimes you have to sew against the clock. Typically, and you told me at lunch, it's International Book Day at school, or it's the nativity play, and you're only told about it the night before, so you're doing something in a hurry. And there's a wonderful dress in the V&A North, Dundee, aren't we? We're in Dundee, okay. And it's a dress made out of tiny, weeny, it's a child's dress, a frock, made out of little tiny, weeny snippets of material. And it was made in the 1940s, and the little girl told her mum, oh, I've got a party tomorrow, and I haven't got a frock. Oh, God. And it was wartime, and, so she just rushed around the house, and she was sort of snipping bits off the curtains, or and finding little bits that she could take, and stayed up all night to make this frock, which is now happily cared for in a museum. But you see, that's sewing against the clock. So maybe British Sewing Bee isn't that
unrealistic.
It's not unrealistic, and they set quite good tests, don't they? You have to upcycle, or you have to. Yeah, I think it's doing a lot of good.
Yes. Oh, it was the mentioning upcycling. Throughout the book, you talk about sort of the environmental impact of, and also societal impact of sewing, whether that's the materials, but we mentioned the fast fashion and the upcycling and the recycling. But this isn't something that just affects us today. It's also had an impact through history, whether it was sort of needs must, but also the growing of the cottons and things like that. So it seems that sewing and the environment is intimately connected and have been through time.
Yes, indeed. I mean, you've only got to think of a pair of blue jeans, you know. Cotton and indigo have been shackled together, if you like, for centuries. And the conditions in which cotton was produced, and indeed now is being produced, for example, in by the Uyghur people in China, that has been described by our own government's subcommittee on this as genocide. I mean, the conditions are just unthinkable. And indigo, when it was first cultivated, you had to, when it was first processed, I suppose, in the early days, you had to stand up to your waist in a vat all day, you know, tramping away and so on. And so the conditions in which these things were made have always been pretty awful. And of course, cotton it has been called recently the first global fibre. It was traded globally before almost anything else. And that, of course, makes us think about, colonisation and slavery and so on. And so when you look into the production of textiles and also the production of clothes, I mean, the clothing, I think people think that between 60 and 70 million people globally are involved in making ready-made clothes. 60 to 70 million people. And if you can drill down a bit, somewhere around 5 million people in India are home workers. So they are quite almost entirely beyond the reach of legislation, of protection, of fair pay, and so on. And that, wherever you look, you know, rivers flowing red with toxic dyes and so on. There's a sew-on to, sorry, excuse the pun, but there is a sew-on to almost all of it. Wherever you look, there's something else. And it's very disturbing from an environmental point of view. But sometimes it's difficult to be sustainable. There was a parson in the late 18th century in Norfolk called Parson Woodford, and he kept diaries and he kept accounts and he was, kept control of his household. And he had a niece called Nancy who also wrote a diary, and sometimes they don't say the same things about the same events. But he thought he was really helping her by her great-aunt died, and there were 3 frocks that the great-aunt left. So there is young Nancy. Instead of being given a clothing allowance for that year, she's given the great-aunt's 3 frocks. So she sets 2 and she remodels them, and one is brown and so on. So it's not quite what she would have liked. And then the next time she gets an allowance, dress allowance from her uncle, she shoots off to Norwich and she buys a beautiful blue new frock. So yes, you can be sustainable with your inherited materials and stuff, but sometimes the love of new things overcomes us, doesn't it? And there are big organisations like GOTS and so on, and who are trying to make the production of cloth, working with the fibres, trying to make that healthier and better. But it's very, very, very difficult to keep. I think there's one organisation, I think it's H&M, are held up by the United Nations as a case in point of how difficult it is to control all this, because they have 4,000 suppliers. Now, each of those suppliers will have a supplier, and that chap said, oh, yes, I'll sell you organic cotton, but he's buying it from non-organic, and so it goes on. It's really, really difficult to control. But I think our individual actions will, we talk with our wallets. I think we can make change.
I think it's probably time we took a question from our audience. Does anybody have a question? do wave to me nicely if you have a question, because I'm looking into bright lights. So, have you got any questions?
It's about tailoring in Savile Row. So, I've never been to one. Is it full of men? Is it full of women? And how do the apprentices get to those positions then to be working in the big tailors?
When you're working in a quality tailor like that, you're either a cutter or you're the stitching side. They're not the same people. They're in the same workshop or one room behind another, but they're different skills. But really important, the cutting. You know, when you paid £100 for a metre of best Italian silk suiting or something, the cutter has to be really good. And that has traditionally been a man's affair. But more and more young women are going into tailoring, and I think that Savile Row is beginning to be a little bit more, a tiny bit less male. But of course, many of the customers are men, and when you're fitting somebody, whether it's a dress or an expensive suit, it's quite intimate. And I often wonder whether there's an element of that going on. But of course, if you're spending £8,000 or something on your Savile Row suit, it's made of the best materials, and you're not going to go gardening in it or something, are you? You know, you're going to take really good care of it, and it will last and last. So if you divided that suit by the number of wears, you get, you know, in the 19th century or 18th century, you often inherited your father's greatcoat, and it got worn for another generation. So I think the whole feel of making men's clothes is very different to women's wear.
It is a reflection of what you said about young people not knowing any skills. We did some church repair cafe, and students came in, and they really don't know how to put, thread in needle or sew button. And my question is about satisfaction. It's not just repairing clothing, but when you're making something, the feeling of satisfaction, because yes, the other students, with sewing machine, and it's quite simple to do. It is dangerous, it could be, but if you teach them, they made little bags, and the satisfaction what they made.
Yes.
And there was Asian culture people, I presume they mostly buying things. So the satisfaction was really great. Yes.
I could read you the words of a student, actually, a young student called Hazel, who wrote to me and told me about her feelings about sewing. She said, she feels, quote, "The process of sewing is like singing and breathing. You can relax and feel super happy when you're doing them. In this case, it's not the end thing that you are enjoying, but something you are enjoying doing. It's the doing that is the bit that a lot of people enjoy." A lot of people told me it's not the doing, it's the finishing. And then other people told me it's not the finishing, it's the giving. And out of all these people I've talked to, only one person sewed entirely for themselves. My local dressmaker in COVID was, making lots of PPE, a lot of people did. She also repaired the flag for the church tower, or giving gifts. And also, a lot of people feel they're making memories when they're making. If I may, I'll just read this, if I can find it. This is a woman called Elaine, who has sewed all her life. This is about satisfactions, I think, but disseminating that satisfaction. She said, "The christening dress I made for my son's children from his wife's Harrod's wedding dress, I had to brace myself to cut into the gorgeous silk taffeta of the wedding dress. Oh. It had a chiffon overskirt with a shadow embroidery in an Irish knot design. His wife, her daughter-in-law, she's cutting up her daughter-in-law's wedding dress, is Irish. To date," she continues, "it has been worn by my 5 Irish grandchildren, 4 of their cousins, and a friend's baby, who is one of twins, so it's already a family heirloom." And a journalist wrote about it was an exhibition on Liberty fabrics, Tana Lawn. Got a lot of conversations going. And her mother, the journalist's mother, had made her a Tana Lawn frock when she was 7 or something. And she realised, as soon as she was given it, this is a dress for doing anything in. You go to parties, you ride your bike, you climb trees. It's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing. Of course, she outgrew it. And then her mother died. And as a young woman, she found this dress at the bottom of her mother's wardrobe, preserved. So she doesn't have children of her own. She sent it to her niece in Australia. It fitted the niece, and the niece said, "Oh, this is dressing, do anything in. You can climb trees, you can ride bikes." And it was, she talked about that as a way of passing on a memory, passing on the satisfactions, the rewards, and in a way linking that family together by this one little frock. I find that a very touching piece that she wrote.
You talk quite a bit about mindfulness and mendfulness.
Yes, mindfulness is not my term, but I wish it was. It's an absolutely super word. And I got to the end of the book and I think, oh God, have I got enough men in this book? You know? And then I thought of Edward Carpenter. I don't know if anybody knows about Edward Carpenter. He was an early socialist and a great advocate of single-sex relationships. And he bought a little small holding in the end of the 19th century. He had some money, and he bought this little small holding outside Sheffield, about 7 acres or something. And people came, girl students from the Slade with their short hair, and socialists and gay people, and they sort of gathered around him. And he had a sewing box. He did all his mending. He said mending was a terrible burden on bourgeois women. Mending all the time, and pockets were all badly designed so they went and they had to be mended again. And he did all his own mending, and there's a wonderful passage, which actually I quote in here, about his coat, expensive tailor-made coat, and he thinks it's too heavy, too complicated, I want the simple life. So he takes the coat apart and is appalled. Some people would be delighted to see the level of skills inside a man's coat, but he thought it was dreadful. It was heavy and all padded out and stuffed and everything. So he took to pieces, and it became a rag rug. And then the rag rug eventually becomes his dog's bed. And then the dog's bed, I don't know what the dog thought about it, the dog's bed was taken and put on the compost heap. And he was really pleased. He'd kind of created this cycle between this expensive coat and the compost heap. And he talked about standing up for the simple life, the deliberately simple life. And he wrote something called The Simple Life. And there was a group, it was a sort of a movement of these people, not exactly William Morris, but people rather like him, called Simple Lifers. And so doing your own sewing for men as well was all part of that. And so I thought, well, we'd get Edward Carpenter in because he's a real standout figure, and we've all rather forgotten him. Although I think there's probably an Edward Carpenter society that you could connect up with. But so I've contacted Sheffield Museum and said, I read in your catalogue that you've got Edward Carpenter's sewing box. I want to see it. And a bit later, they got back to me and said, terribly sorry, we've lost it. We can't find it. So I never saw it, but it does exist.
There's a question right up there.
Oh, yes, right at the back.
I was just wondering whether you observed any north-south divide within sewing, because with the mills being up north predominantly, and the demise of the mills and all that, whether people who were working in the mills had access to fabric more, and maybe people made more things up north, or whether down south there was the equivalent somewhere. I don't know.
It certainly crops up in a number of testimonies from older people, and also in oral histories. Some of the biggest and best oral history projects have been done in the mill towns. Wonderful. Hundreds of people being interviewed about their experiences in the mills. Including a little girl, a lovely lady who, when she was a little girl, lost 4 fingers because she got caught up in the belt and whipped up to the ceiling. But also the good things about working in mills and factories as well. And yes, people there would speak of getting bundles of cloth at cut price because they were working in the mill, or they had an aunt who worked in the mill and could get stuff, you know. So that was about what I would call improvised sewing, because you didn't really choose the bundle you got, but you got one, and you made it into something. And I think it gives, of course, being surrounded by the mills and the textile manufacturer, it gives you an appreciation of what goes into making cloth, I think. Yes, I do think whether people make more or less, I don't know how one would measure that. It's very unmeasured, it's very unquantitative, all this stuff, because it's just not in the record books. You can measure, you can say, oh, well, more sewing machines get sold in the north and the south or something, but you don't know how they're used or if they're used, unwanted presents or something. It's very hard to fix numbers on it, but you are right that I think being raised in a mill town, you do have a stronger sense of cloth, and you have a sense of, and it was a sort of alternative way of getting it at affordable prices. I think somebody had a hand up down there. Yes.
Yes, thank you. You've brought back so many memories. I could talk for half an hour. I won't, I promise. I was born in the 1920s, and thank you. And my first recollection of sewing is watching my aunt and my mother making French knickers. And I was fascinated by this because they did little bits of embroidery on the corners of the legs as well.
Yes.
And I was going to bring you today a sampler I made when I was about 7. Some wealthy relation bought it for me, a printed sampler. And I've still got it, framed. And a quilt I made in the last few years. And I have sewn my entire life, made children's clothes, my clothes, and then when they were too big, I started doing patchwork. And I really love that.
Yes.
But the thing, I know it should really be a question.
Yes, please.
When you said the most intricate best sewers were on Savile Row.
Or in Paris, in the Haute Couture,
right.
in the Maison.
What about the Minster broderers? Do you know about them?
Well, there's the Opus Anglicanum exhibition at the V&A had to be held over. They extend it because it was so popular, as people are discovering the relationship between the church and these fine levels of embroidery and so on. I have avoided embroidery in the book because embroidery's got so many friends, so many exhibitions, so many books, and it's what the museums used to collect. Yeah. What I find really, really interesting, and don't forget you have the Quilters Guild Museum here in York. Mm-hmm. You know? It's closed. It's only closed temporarily, hasn't it? Closed forever. The collection's still there, which you can see by appointment, I think, can't you? Yeah. But York Castle Museum, for example, was he a general, Fairfax, on the parliamentary side, and his buff coat, beautifully made. It's got silk in it and all kinds of things. Marvellous thing from the 1660s. Rare. But the museum curators, in writing it up for the public, have said, who made this? It's not just him wearing it. Who made it? And where did the materials come from? And so on. And I think that I keep saying and so on, I'm so sorry. So that's, I think, a wonderful thing. And they also have, there's a gentleman whose name I can't remember, who I think for 20 years has been the principal dame in the...
Berwick Kaler.
Berwick Kaler. A fantastic outfit that the museum has kept. And they also describe how that was made, who made it. And lots of... in terms of activism, you didn't ask about activism, but I'd like to say something about activism. I think that we all know about the suffragettes and their banners and so on. And the woman who led the sort of art guild for the suffragettes, a painter, Mary Lowndes, was asked, how can I make a banner? Because the professional banner makers were doing it. And this woman said, I want to make a banner for myself. And she said, if you can make a pair of dining room curtains that hang properly, you can make a banner. And so women were starting to make their own banners. And that was an activist thing, and very brave, you know, to walk the streets and get pelted and shouted at and everything. And I think I also count people who feel themselves gender fluid or non-standard body size or disabled, making clothes for themselves as a kind of activist, you know, because they're saying, well, look, the high street doesn't cater for me, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to present myself in the way I want to be presented. So can I read a little bit from a group? There's a wonderful group in America called the Curvy Sewing Collective. You should look them up. There's 25,000 of them.
Can't all sit in a room at the same time.
No. So the learning vanishing from schools has been replaced by learning on the internet, by tons and tons of groups. And one of the women I interviewed said, or she wrote to me in our sewing stories, I said, what's your favourite tool? She said, my iPad. So this is what Seamwork Purpose say. It's an American grouping where you can go and share your makes or learn how to do this or that. And this is what it means. And this is typical of very strong claims made for sewing by these sorts of groups, by what I think of as the new sewing. It is a way to infuse creativity deeply into our everyday lives and to feel connected to who we are and our impact on the world. We each have a limited amount of time in our lives. We simply can't make more time. But we can choose what we do with it. We can make a choice to place our attention on the acts of creativity that fill us up and bring beauty into our lives. We can choose to pay attention to ourselves and inspire others to do the same. We can connect around our passion. This connectivity of these internet groups is wonderful. We can connect around our passion, encouraging each other to become more thoughtful, more aware, and more self-sustaining. And that kind of language, which is very outspoken language, is more and more common on the internet in terms of helping people to learn to sew or other creative activities. And I think that's really important, because you certainly didn't feel like that in school, in your school lessons, I bet. But now you can learn in this entirely other way, much more friendly, much safer, much more individually driven. You're not sewing by rote. So they're yes, and do look up the Curvy Sewing Collective.
Hello, this might be a slightly strange question, but
I'm
thinking of costumes that I've seen in various costume places like the V&A or
yes.
other places, and where you can really see the stitching, and it's absolutely minute hand
yes.
stitching.
Yes.
And I'm sort of thinking about eyesight, actually. I'm thinking about poor lighting. I'm thinking about people, particularly poorer people, historically having to work, sewing in the evenings by firelight or candlelight or whatever, and with it being predominantly a women's job to do. So I'm just wondering, almost like about the health implications, particularly as far as eyesight is concerned, and was wondering if you'd got any feedback from any of the people you interviewed about that.
Not so much from interviews, but certainly by the end of the 19th century there was terrific concern about the conditions of dressmakers. And you only had to have one senior member of the royal family to die, and suddenly everybody's got to go into mourning, and so that all the workshops, sweatshops really, would turn to that. And they were expected to make things. The Ghost in the Looking Glass was a very famous Victorian cartoon in Punch, Ghost in the Looking Glass. So the young woman's preening herself in the looking glass, but behind her is almost the ghost of this worn-out, haggard dressmaker. And Richard Redgrave, the painter, painted a picture called The Sempstress. And the sun is rising through her garret window. And she is pale and thin and underfed with this huge pile of work that she's got to complete. So those were serious concerns. William Morris said, let's avoid all this stuff. Don't upholster yourself like armchairs, he said. Choose a simple, single style that really suits you and your lifestyle and stick with it. And then that will be kinder to the dressmakers. That is about eyesight, but it's also about crowded conditions, poor diet. It's about exploitation. And that continues to today. It really does continue today. In Leicester, during COVID, a number of people in factories in Leicester were required to come in, even if they had COVID. If you don't come in, you'll lose your job. And that's also linked to child labour. I mean, so it's not all in Asia. A lot of it is down the road from us. And these conditions, by having to ask if you could go to the loo in clothing factories, for example. So there's been a long, long, long historical association between dressmaking, particularly, and exploitation and poor conditions. The eyesight thing and the size of stitches, if you look at, I love botched stitching. I really enjoy being in the back rooms of a museum and somebody showing me a beautiful mantua and it's all gorgeous silk and everything, and you turn it, and you can't turn it inside out, you're not allowed to, but you can kind of poke around, and they're really big stitches because it was expected that you would take it apart. And you might even turn it and wear it the other way around, or you'd take it apart so you could wash it or have it cleaned more easily, or you'd take it apart because you want to restyle it. So you could modernise your grandmother's damask, into a frock, or you got pregnant and you needed to change the shape and so on. So there are big stitches out there and botched stitches. And in the pocket book, we've got some beautiful photographs of really botched stitching, where early sewing machines, chain stitch sewing machines, really early examples, where people just think, oh my goodness, you could do a straight line and then, oh, I've got to go around the corner. And so it all gets buckled up and everything and so on. So it's not all good stitching out there, but some of the very best stitching I've ever seen is in Manchester Museum, a set of underclothing made by somebody called Fanny Jarvis. And her stitching is so regular and so tiny. It's on white, so it's perhaps a bit easier. And she's a woman of means, so she had big windows, or she wasn't starving hungry, or doing other jobs as well. She was just, it's incredibly regular. And sometimes you have to think, how do you tell the difference in a sewing machine stitch and some of this extraordinary stitching? I was told by a woman who was a child in the 1930s who had submitted a piece of work, I think it was a little frock, for a competition. I think it was Daily Express had sewing competitions, and she sent it in, and they sent it back and said, no, it's got to be hand sewing. This is sewn by machine. Oh, but I sewed it. Oh, no, you didn't, it's machine. And so she was marked by that experience for a long time. So I think you can see, I mean, people talk about embroidery being expressive, and so it can be, but I think plain stitching is chiefly what this book is about, the point of the needle. I think plain stitching is expressive. You can see it's botched and hurried, or you can see it's slow and regular, and it's fascinating what stitching will tell you if you give it time. Does that answer your question a bit?
Yes.
Yeah.
And on that note, that brings us beautifully to time. So can you please join me in thanking Barbara for fascinating insight into sewing? And please remember the book, and also the book about the pocket, which is beautifully illustrated, lots of lovely photographs. 160 pictures is available, and Barbara will be very happy to sign them for you if you would like. So thank you very much indeed for coming, and enjoy the rest of the York Festival of Ideas. Hope to see you at something else. Thank you very much, folks.